We are joined by Dr. Lane, who is a professor at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. She was a senior advisor in the Office of the Federal CIO at the White House. She co-founded the Coleridge Initiative, which works with government organizations to ensure that data are more effectively used for public decision-making. Dr. Lane holds a PhD in economics from the University of Missouri, which is also where she earned a master's in statistics. She earned her bachelor's degree in economics and Japanese from Massey University in New Zealand. So Dr. Matthew Martinez is not here with us today, but he is a senior data scientist at Meta and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio, which is where we all will be next week for ADSA's annual meeting. So to briefly share a little bit about Dr. Martinez, his research is centered around developing an understanding of the relationship between race, ethnicity, and educational outcomes. He earned his bachelor's in sociology and philosophy from UTSA, a master's in sociology from Baylor University, and a PhD in applied demography from UTSA. And then last but not least, we're joined by Dr. Bradley Voytek. He is a professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at UC San Diego. His research lab uses data science methods to study how brain regions communicate with one another and how that communication changes with aging and disease. Dr. Voytek earned a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Southern California and a PhD in neuroscience from UC Berkeley. After completing his PhD, he joined Uber as their first data scientist before returning to academia. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today, and I am very excited for our discussion. So now I'm just going to turn it over to you, Dr. Lane, if you want to start us off by sharing a little bit more about your background and what brought you back to academia.
I started out as an academic, and I've gone back and forth. I've given up tenure twice. This is my third stint as a tenured full professor. And I got involved in working with data as an assistant professor and got really interested in using data to answer economic questions. And so I worked with confidential microdata from states to look at the return to investment in jobs and built the first linked employer-employee data set in the US at scale. And it's the first, I guess, national statistical data set that's been started by researchers. So that kind of led to working a lot with computer scientists and very early days at the NSF. And then I went and worked in the private sector, in not-for-profits and consulting firms, then to the government, to the National Science Foundation, and then back to academia. So that's kind of my story. So I don't know if you want me to embroider that, but it's just been stuff comes along and then you think, oh, that would be fun. And then you do something else, right? So I think the notion of you stuck in one job for 30 years is not the way it works. I don't think there's like an academic track or an industry track. It's just as long as you stay active and engaged and interested, you can move back and forth between the different areas. I don't know what you think, Brad.
If you want to go ahead and jump in.
Yeah.
I do want to say that Dr. Martinez has joined the conversation, so I'm going to add him here as a spotlight, and I will, if you want to go ahead, Dr. Voytek, and introduce or tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came back to academia, and then we'll let you jump in, Dr. Martinez, so that you can get a little bit oriented to what's going on here.
Dr. Lane said it very well. I feel very similarly. There isn't really tracks. It's much more fluid than that, and you're not set in a path forever. I had initially, as an undergraduate, wanted to study physics. I was a physics major, and I was not very good at it. I became more interested in people as I went along in my studies, and thought I was going to become a therapist. I studied psychology to go into clinical psychology, and discovered that the rudimentary programming and mathematical knowledge that I had gained from some of my previous work was very applicable in neuroscience in a way that I didn't realize it could be, because as an undergraduate, I worked in a neuroscience research lab, and fell in love with the subfield of what's called computational neuroscience or theoretical neuroscience, sort of heavily interwoven, and ended up doing my PhD in that area, and was supposed to move to Germany with my wife for a postdoctoral research position there. And she's very close with her family in California. And, we had a very long, difficult conversation about turning this job, amazing job offer down that I had been given in Germany to stay in California with our families, or with her family. And so I guess long story short, I was having a dinner party with friends at our house. We were hosting a party, and I was lamenting the fact that I'd been in school now for 20 something years and finished my PhD, and I still didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And one of my friends who had dropped out of college as an undergraduate to work in the tech scene in the late 1990s and 2000s said, well, you did data stuff during your PhD, right? I just started working for this startup, and we need like a data person. Do you want to come and interview with us? And I said, sure. I'm probably not going to go into industry, but I'll chat. And that was Uber back when it was a very small 10-person startup in San Francisco with 6 to 10 drivers total in all of the system. We knew all their names, and I got tasked with trying to figure out how do we use the data coming off of these phones, from the driver phones and the client phones, in order to actually do demand prediction and make the service better. And that morphed into mostly like data PR, trying to figure out how does a 10-person startup in the Bay Area in 2011, when Facebook and Twitter and Google were the hottest things around and had huge data teams, try and convince people to work for a cab company, which is, at the time it was called Uber Cab before they got slapped with a cease and desist and rebranded. Decidedly not nearly as interesting on paper, at least. And so I started trying to do a lot of networking and data analyses to convince people that this is actually a hard data problem and an interesting one. And that got me down this road of what is now data science. And I got to meet a lot of fantastic people. Actually, Julia, you may know, DJ Patel, who was the chief data scientist for the US. He and I became friends and colleagues through those years, and excellent person, just a really great human being. And in a lot of ways a mentor. Like, I learned a lot from him. But ultimately, at the end of the day, as exciting and amazing and interesting and frustrating and terrifying as that time there was, at the end of the day, my love was still in neuroscience. And so like Dr. Lane had mentioned, you sort of go back and forth, right? And so I sort of pushed in that direction and found it interesting, but I kept getting pulled back into the basic neuroscience research. And so while I still have a foot in industry and now nonprofit world, I keep that very separate. I don't work in the neurotech space at all. I keep my industry work pretty separate from the academic side of things that I do, but I enjoy both, and they have their pros and cons.
Great, thank you. We'll dive a little bit more into that. Dr. Martinez, welcome. So I have already introduced a little bit about your background, and so if you just want to share a little bit more about your role and your either journey back into academia, or you may have actually kept a foot into academia since graduation. I'm not sure, but if you want to share a little bit more with us all about that.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. So my journey, right, with academia, I think starts even before that, before I became a PhD. It was my journey into law school, and I wanted to be a lawyer. I did the LSAT, did all that, right, and was set to go to Pepperdine, and then kind of one day woke up and didn't feel right about it within myself. And so I was like, all right, well, throw caution to the wind, and we'll see where life is going to lead me next. And I was doing AmeriCorps Vista at the time. So, I felt like the next idea was like, well, I want to do research. I've been interested in I was working with, students who were in areas that were historically impoverished, and just kind of seeing the connection between that and educational attainment. I was like, I want to study this more. I want to see how we can drive this in a policy perspective. So I figured I'd get my PhD, and went to pursue that. Right, I did 2 years at Baylor, and then I fell in love with stats. I took some early intro to stats courses, but the program that I was in was a lot more theoretically focused, and so it wasn't going to give me any more of the statistical background that I was actually finding that I was really enjoying. So I found another program here in San Antonio at UTSA, demography. The first one was in sociology, and I felt like, oh, there was a lot more courses, survivor analysis, right? You're talking about like different compositions of populations and studies, and say, okay, this seems really interesting. So I'm going to go there, right? I'm going to switch and finish my PhD there. And then that led me to getting a postdoc out at Brown, doing research on historical neighborhood segregation, and really like focusing it in on the post-antebellum South in that research. That led me then to going into Houston at Rice, doing education research, working with the Educational Research Partnership. Really cool work that they're doing still there. You work directly with administrators in school districts to help them solve problems and bring data to those issues with student retention or absences, or there's a whole set of problems there that really need data work. But after a while, I felt like, there was an economic consideration to all of the work I was doing. I was doing publications, I was able to get into some good journals like Cities or American Sociological Journal, like an AJS and all that. I had these top tier publications, but I wasn't landing a job as I wanted to be a professor and continue to do this type of research. So I felt like, well, what are some other options that I can still have impact and contribute to the academic field? And I felt like, well, that path was taking a job in industry, which at the time was at USAA, large insurer, and still being an adjunct, So I kept kind of both. I was still doing some publications with colleagues from Rice and Brown and finishing off papers and that kind of thing. And then that led me into, I started as a modeling analyst, became a data scientist, and I really enjoyed that line of work. And then one day, got a phone call from Meta, and, they were doing data science for integrity related problems on Facebook, meaning misinformation, graphic violence and nudity, and all the stuff that you hopefully don't see. Or if you do see, it's very rare, and jarring, and that's because of the work that we are doing in that space with detection and scoring and just a whole slew of data related problems that at scale really can only be solved in these ways, through modeling and prediction, that kind of stuff. So now that's what I do, and I haven't done as much of the academic work, although I think another colleague and I, we've got out a paper this year. So yeah, I kind of keep a foot in the door just in case, like I want to go and retire and be just an adjunct, like I feel like the compensation in tech allows you to save up and then have kind of a second phase of life, which sounds like Brad has a little bit of that with the nonprofit work, and I'm interested to hear his journey in that regard as well.
Great, thank you. So very diverse experiences here, but a common thread of kind of being interested in multiple things and kind of keeping your foot in different doors is what I'm getting from here. So Dr. Voytek, I guess we'll just go back and start with you. Can you tell us a little bit of what it was like when you, what was the process like when you were trying to go back into academia? Was it difficult? How did you line up opportunities and search for opportunities in academia?
The timing actually was pretty interesting because, like I said, I had turned down this postdoctoral research opportunity in Germany. And so I began asking a couple of people that I knew in California in the neurosciences if they were looking for any postdocs. And a couple of people said they were interested, but they didn't have money. But if I had, my own money, I could do it. And so I actually had managed to secure a postdoctoral fellowship, but I had already accepted the job at this point at Uber. And so I was able to delay the onset of the fellowship, and the postdoctoral mentor that I was working with at UC San Francisco was okay with me doing that as well. And so I made an agreement then with my direct report boss at Uber that I would help them build out this data team and build out some of the strategy that we had been brainstorming and figuring out. This point, my wife was pregnant with our first child as well. And so I said, okay, I will continue doing all this up until 2 weeks before my son's due date. And then I'm going to separate. And like Matthew had said, I was able to save up money just in that little bit of time that I was working at Uber versus the academic postdoc route, to be able to take a actual paternity leave, unpaid, but sort of pseudo paid for my time at Uber. And then I was going to start my postdoc at UC San Francisco, and sort of renegotiated. Uber really wanted to keep me on, and some of the early work I was doing was some crude financial modeling, and I'd kind of seen the writing on the wall of where Uber was going as it caught on, and so I didn't exactly want to step away from all the stock options either. But the person I was directly reporting to and I sort of clashed quite often. And so sort of renegotiated to be a stock earning consultant at Uber, and sort of moonlighted there basically, nights every now and then, occasional weekends, and sort of pushing forward on the postdoctoral work. And my wife and I had an agreement that I'd try and find a tenure track faculty job on the West Coast or Arizona, where our families are. And if after 4 years of postdocing that didn't pan out, then my fallback plan would be this lucrative data science career that I've been building up, and we could stay in the Bay Area. And I'd made a ton of connections in the industry at this point, and had a couple of standing offers. And so very fortuitous, right? In my family, we'd mentioned in the sort of pre-conversation earlier, is in Northern Arizona. I'm the first, one in my family to go to college, let alone, PhD and all this other stuff. And so even as a postdoc, I was making more money than most of my family. And so that sort of comfort with not earning a ton of money made me actually able to take a lot more risks. And like it made it a little bit more flexible. And so even in the worst case scenario, my fallback plan was fun. I really enjoyed the problems that we're working on in data science in the industry. It felt still kind of researchy, and it scratched that itch for me, but also, some pretty amazing people, and some not so amazing people, but that's true in every domain. So just got to pick and choose, but I had a blast. And so I was able to sort of really thread that needle, because a lot of people were very open to allowing me to do so.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like a little bit of luck, but also a lot of planning.
Well, let's be
there.
clear, a lot of luck, a lot of luck.
A lot of luck, but
and
but
some
there was
wonderful
definitely,
mentorship.
Yeah, planning and some very important conversations, some difficult ones too, it sounds like, for that transition back.
Those difficult conversations at the right time, and standing up for yourself and what you want and what you're looking for, is critical also.
Yeah, definitely. How about you, Dr. Martinez? Do you want to share a little bit about what that process was for when you decided you want to pursue an academic career in addition to your job at USAA and Meta? What was that process like? How did you approach your journey back? You're muted.
I always do that at work, so it makes sense that I do it here. I'll talk for 5 seconds and then realize I'm muted. Yeah, so the journey, right, like at USA, it felt a lot more natural and easy, right? I'll just be honest with that, because my manager was a lot more open to it. It was something that he did himself, where he was being an adjunct and right, teaching part-time and working at USAA. So he was open to it and gave me some foots in the door to do that work. You know, I probably would have still done it had I not, and this goes to Brad's case, right? I felt like I stood up for my students in a way that made me not desirable to the university I was teaching at. Because, you know, they stuck 50 grad students in my class, and I felt like that was not deserving of a grad student experience. And so I stood up for them and for what I felt they needed, and I wasn't invited back the next semester, but that's something that, right, happens, right? That is something that happens. Brad said there are people who are good, people who aren't, in both worlds. And I do have a desire to go back, right, eventually to do the adjunct teaching. But I think right now, the way my schedule is at Meta is going to make it a little less likely, just because, you know, the work that we're on, right, like it requires a lot of the time. Now, I could choose, right, to do things at night and weekends if I desired to, but that's not kind of where I'm at currently. Where I'm at currently, right, just being an advocate for students that are desiring mentorship, right, or even like some former students of mine, right, that are looking for jobs, that kind of connections that I think we can still have. But I think what Brad is hitting on is a really crucial point that I felt like I wish I would have known earlier, was that everything is up for negotiation. Especially if you're a desirable candidate, right? Like you can, and I think that he's right, and I'll reiterate that you should know what you want and be able to vocalize that and not be afraid to do that, because I think that will open more doors, and that you'll see more opportunities and possibilities than you thought before, by just saying like, oh, they're not going to be, right? Don't count yourself out, right? They're like, oh, no one's going to allow me to do teaching on the side or do research on the side or work with a university while I'm at this industry job. Like, why not? Why not ask? Why not pursue? You don't know what opportunities exist, and I think being your own advocate, right, is the best way. So I guess that's kind of how I'd answer the question, is that right now I'm in a holding pattern. I have, like, you know, you still keep the connections, you still keep an eye out for things that are happening in academia, but one day I hope to get back to being an adjunct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Lane, do you want to share a little bit more about your process for returning to academia and how you pursued and kind of lined up those opportunities?
What an interesting conversation. What an interesting set of stories. So I was kind of mapping that back into my own experience, and I think going back to what I said, the sheer joy of working with real problems and real data is what's always driven me. So I just love it. I work really hard, but it doesn't feel like work. It just doesn't. It just feels like fun every day. I really have kept my eye always on getting publications. Wherever I've been publishing, I was told very early on that there are two units of academic currency: grants and publications. And so you've got to keep your eye on that ball, because if you don't, then you're going to vanish. So you really have to keep that visibility. But you do it because you love it. If you're doing it because you think you have to, what's the point, right? Very interested in what Matthew said. I don't know if it's Matt or Dr. Martinez. Sorry, I should be polite. I think I had a little bit of a different experience. I'm a woman, obviously, and I had 3 kids. I had 1, 2, and then, oh no, she knows she's little. Oh no, oh no is the polite term. And you know, we wrote a piece in Nature about women not getting credited in science as much as men. And I always thought, you know, it was me. That turns, or it was I. But I do think that I going back to what Dr. Martinez said, speaking up for yourself is a really important, it's not just having the love of the work and the joy of the work, it is speaking up for yourself And Dr. Voytek mentioned that as well, keeping the connections and the interest and just staying out there. Part of the reason that I moved as much as I did, was at several points in my career, it was, well, I really did not see that I was going to get the recognition or the raises in one position. And so I could either suck it up or I could move. So I moved. And I think a lot of people, maybe a lot of women, don't do that because they're not sure, and it's risky and it's difficult to change. But I think that it's an important thing to do. And if you're good, if you get out there, things will come your way. That's kind of, you have to keep that visibility going, and things just pop up, and then you take them.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and jump into some questions that I received before the panel today. And one of them is, so I don't know who would like to speak to this, but we've kind of already spoken a little bit about this, but the question is, I've been told that once you leave academia, it's almost impossible to go back. The question is specifically about, is data science an exception? But I just am sort of curious, in your experience, is it pretty rare? I mean, I've always been told that this is sort of like, you all are kind of like unicorn people, and it never really happens. Do you see this happening more often, or do you still think that it's difficult to do? Dr. Voytek, do you want to jump in and share
Sure,
your
I'll try and keep
thoughts?
it brief. Data science is not the exception, but it is helpful. And really what it comes down to is kind of market forces, right? So you've got a position here where there is a large demand for teaching certain topics and for research in certain domains. You know, I'm in the UC system, which is a public system. All of our salaries and everything is publicly available. And there's actually 2 tiers of salary within the University of California for tenure track faculty. There's everybody else, and then there's people who are faculty in school in business, economics, and law, and engineering. And so in those domains, business, economics, law, and engineering, you can make a lot more money in the private sector than you can in the academic sector. And so the University of California has to pay faculty in those domains higher. And what that means is that there are a lot of job opportunities in those domains, right? How do you hire somebody who's a data scientist at, you know, as assistant professor in data science at a public university making $90,000 a year when they can be making double that easily in the private sector? And so in those domains, business, law, econ, engineering in general, it's easier to move back and forth between industry and academia because of the supply and demand. And, you know, if I'm in biology or something like that, then there's not as many opportunities in industry. And so it's harder to move back and forth because for any one faculty job in the tenure track line for, you know, there's just many orders of magnitude more qualified candidates, you know, than there are jobs. So it becomes that sort of supply and demand issue. There's a lot more I could talk about it, but I don't want to we take all the time, so I'll let the other speakers go.
Dr. Martinez, do you want to jump in on this topic? Have you
I
seen
would
this?
just say, yeah, I would just say that to me, right, like it depends on role as well and what you're aiming for. You know what I mean? Like an adjunct professor or a teaching professor, that type of thing might be easier to go and get. And it really depends on the field that you're in and where, you know, the school system that you're trying to get into as well, right? If you're trying to teach at a you know, an R1 research university, I could see that being a lot more difficult just because if you're not doing the research in the pubs that you have as a in your private sector, then it's going to be harder. And that doesn't make it right, like one's better or not. It really isn't. It's just about fit, right? It's about like learning where that fits and being okay if like, and I think that's part of it too, right? Like in my own journey, this is what I thought, and this is what I thought, but I was okay with getting here, and here was actually better, right? For me, like it was, you know, I thought I wanted to be an R1, you know, research professor and then learn like, yeah, I probably wouldn't have been happy, but that's just me, right? So it's about what you're aiming for, and then also like some realistic expectations for what's out there and what you can get.
Well, again, I'm an economist, and so I look for the non-pecuniary benefits, but you know, at the end of the day, that doesn't buy dinner. So I have been very focused on not being a female that is happy to take a, to Michaela's point, to take a lower salary. I'm very happy with the way I ended up in both dimensions. But being a tenured full professor at an R1 institution, I mean, that what they say is just to set expectations here is, you know, it's harder for a high school basketball class, you know, team in the US to get to the NBA than it is, you know, there's very, very few and decreasing numbers of these kind of positions in academia. So resetting expectations is going to be important. You may be aware we're coming to a demographic cliff. So, you know, it's really a shrinking market. When I started, which was quite a while ago, you know, you went into, it was relatively straightforward to get an academic job. Now people have to get, I did a bachelor's and then I got a PhD and then boom, off I went. Now there is, people will do a master's and they'll get a PhD. It'll take 6 years to get a PhD and then they'll do a postdoc. So in a lot of cases, even if you get a tenure track position, you're 38, 39, 40, and you know that you've been on starvation wages for a very long time. So I'm not sure that academia is anymore an optimal lifestyle. It is, I was struck by the fact that Dr. Voytek said, you know, I've made my bucks and now I can do my own stuff. So the challenge is not just getting into academia, but also being prepared for the very long time it takes to get through to a decent living. You take a look at, we're overproducing PhDs.
Yeah, and to that note, actually, this question that I also received from an audience member before this panel, I think you could speak best to this, Dr. Lane. The question is, did your time outside of academia make it more difficult to obtain tenure? So was it difficult to get those publications out, or the types of publications that you needed in order to, when you went up for tenure review, to sort of, yeah, qualify for everything that they were looking for?
I was hired in with tenure here. I was hired in with a package, so that's quite normal, where, you know, if again, if you've got the publications and you've got the grants, then I had half a dozen opportunities with different universities where people were bidding me in at a salary level and you know, a package to pay for a bunch of postdocs and graduate students and staff to work with me. But again, that's because if you pay your dues, right? So getting the publications and the grants and keeping your eye on the ball from the beginning, that opens up an enormous set of opportunities. Because the great thing about being in data science, it's a super hot field. I mean, I wouldn't, when I was talking about the general trajectory of academia, it's not great, but the value proposition, both in industry and in academia and data science, is huge. So I really have not had any challenges. And as long as you I keep saying it, grants, publications, you're golden. I don't know whether Dr. Martinez and Dr. Voytek have the same take.
Similar.
Yeah.
Except I didn't come in with tenure. And so I started on the assistant tenure track ladder. But what I did do was I was a little bit strategic about it. And so, of course, yes, the grants and the publications always matter. But at the time, still to this day, but UC San Diego, when I started here 9 years ago, was adamant that service and things are also very critical for the tenure package. And so I was trying to figure out, I'm not the best and smartest at X, Y, and Z, and I know that. I'm very comfortable with that. Now, I didn't used to be, but I am now. But there are certain things that I am good at, and one of them is organizing people and just putting processes into place. And so when I started here, I started.
Can you talk to my husband?
We'll follow up.
I've been trying for a long time.
This is a skill set that has come hard and slow over the years, but trying to figure out how could I leverage some of that into helping my case. Should the grants and papers and things not work out?
Good point.
And so when I started here, I started teaching an introduction to data science class. It didn't exist in 2014. And I thought there was a gap there. And I thought it would be very fun to teach people about the powers and perils and ethical implications of the society that we're becoming. And that class was 24 students the first quarter I taught it, and then 150, and then 500 students in the third quarter, at which point computer science by this time turned to my department of cognitive science and said, what's happening over there? Why are you taking all of our students? Unbeknownst to me at UC San Diego, computer science was trying to figure out if they wanted to have a data science specialization. And so I got pulled in my second year, first year really of being a faculty member here, onto a committee of 4 people to develop a data science undergraduate degree program. And so while I was running the lab and doing all the normal stuff, I was also sort of establishing myself at the university as being sort of the go-to person for all things data science. And so I'm on a committee of people 30 years older than I am, and the only pre-tenure faculty member. And so I, a couple years later, was recommended I should go up for early tenure. I had some successes in the grants and I had some successes with the papers, but my value to the university in this area was so high that I knew I could negotiate then for the increase in all the other things. So
Good
you
for
want to
you.
be strategic.
Yes, yeah. And entrepreneurial. That's exactly right. Good for you. That's the story.
And so like Dr. Lane was saying, right, you have to figure out what is your value, and Dr. Martinez was saying this too, and then really advocating for yourself and finding other people who advocate for you. And so I was very lucky to have an amazing mentor. He passed away a number of years ago, but when I first started here, and the chair of my department also, she was incredibly supportive. And so the two of them were always there for me to help give me advice and guide me, and I changed my career significantly and my life.
Dr. Martinez, I know you're not in tenure track, but can you maybe share a little bit about the challenges around balancing both an industry job and while also teaching at a university? Did you feel like that impacted your career or the quality of your work, or the sort of conversations you were having?
I would say that at least earlier on, I felt like the teaching, it actually improved my work and industry. And I say that because you learn how to, especially if you're teaching a couple of classes at the beginning, or if you're forming the class, right, you have to think about what's the purpose, what's the problem, what's the goal, how are we going to get there, how am I going to bring others along with me, right? So you're selling vision. You're selling like tooling and mentoring, and you're working with your chair to develop this in the syllabus and making sure it's all aligned, right? So it's really a lot of like, and then you're pontificating, right? And then you're up talking, you're delivering your lectures, right? Which is really helpful in the corporate world to distill the information to someone who doesn't know, right? Like your higher ups, and this was a lot more true at USAA. They don't know all the data stuff. And so you have to really synthesize that into a neat package that is a deliverable that they can understand. And same way with students, right? And so I think like that I would always say that, like, if you have the opportunity, you should probably try and do it, even if it stretches you a little bit time-wise. Now you can negotiate that later on and, you know, drop it or change something, but it's a good tool to really help you in your corporate job. And I think that has kind of shown through later on, right, where it became the types of classes I was teaching, because there was one semester I taught 3 courses, and that was a little too much, right? Like, it's like, all right, one is good, 2, and the type of student as well, where, a student would be a grad course, right? So I taught some data science grad courses, and I also taught an introductory course to college type of thing. And there were students who didn't care, they'd show up high, and you're like, okay, I have to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this, right? So, but I had, like, learning my own ability, right? They're all the football players. Learning my own ability to like, say, no, I don't want that, and I have freedom to choose something else, which I think is something that is really cool when you have a position that is in industry where you can have that freedom to pick and choose, right? Like, your tenure isn't required on that, your job isn't required on that, you're kind of this free agent, and you can kind of go and have more freedom in that way.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. We're almost out of time. This conversation is going by so quickly, so I do want to open it up to you all to ask any questions. And I will go ahead and, Torvit, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, super great conversation, like Dr. Lane said. In this talk, Dr. Martinez talked about, and also Dr. Lane, and the transition that from Uber to the tenured track position. The question would be, is it something you're doing on nights and weekends, like these peer-reviewed publications, when you're not in the academic setting? The focus is on timely and accessible products, and the non-academic setting. But those peer-reviewed publications are the currency. So are you doing those on your nights and weekends? Do you build those into your non-academic jobs? Like, what's that process like? Thanks.
So even in academia, you're doing your publications and grant writing on nights and weekends because you've got so many other things going on. So it's really no different. You just have so much. You just work all the time. But because you love it, it doesn't feel like work.
For me, it was a nights and weekends thing. I couldn't do it now, but when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, and I wasn't sleeping anyway because we had the baby, and so
do you want 3? Take over 3. Take over tuition payments.
It was just something that I sacrificed watching some TV and playing video games and all that kind of stuff for those couple of years, because I had an opportunity on both sides, and I didn't want to give either of them up. And I had still have a very supportive spouse, who took over, woke up earlier, to help get kids out of the door if I had been up late. Yeah, it was. And so now it's I'm very different. It's much more balanced lifestyle, but for those first couple of years it was kind of a grind.
How
It didn't
about you,
have to
Dr.
be, but I made
Martinez?
it that way.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. How about you, Dr. Martinez? Do you want to share a little bit about
I think
how you structured that?
Sure. And I think, like, why I think about my earlier on when I came into industry, why it felt easier, it was probably because I got to industry and I was like, oh, there's nights and weekends, like, they exist. It's not just a phone plan, right? And then you're like, oh, what am I going to do with myself? And then that's when I got into adjunct teaching, which happened at nights and some weekends, right? I could mainly do it during the week at night. But it was like, oh, well, I have all this free time now. I can, 2-3 nights a week is fine, because I was doing that in academia, right? The whole, with Saturdays and Sundays inclusive. So, like, I think, like, that's why it felt more free and more easy to negotiate the two. And probably Brad and Julie, feel the same way about, like, just, hey, like, when you're in industry or when you're in industry, you feel like this sense of like, oh, wow, I got a lot more time than I did when I was in academia.
Well, and remember, you're not working for the man, right? You're working for advancing new ideas, and you're working with people you want to work with, and you're not trying to sell dog food, right? You're doing something that's fundamentally valuable, at least if you're doing the right types of work. So, yeah.
Yeah. I also want to circle back to a question that we got in our chat, which is, so there's been a lot of discussion about advocating for yourself. Do you have any advice for folks who maybe don't really feel comfortable doing that, or, you know, at least getting others to help advocate for you or to sort of sponsor you? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm from New Zealand, and Maori people are not used to advocating for themselves. So actually, what people do is they bring an interlocutor in for them. So that's very standard in job interviews. But I actually think you need to just learn how to speak up for yourself, because that's not as acceptable in the United States. So you just have to learn. I don't think there's any two ways around it. You can't sit back and say, I hope someone really notices me, because it's not going to happen. So I don't know what you guys think.
Okay. So I think like you can get a mentor in industry, then like that's great, right? Like then you can stick with them. I felt like I had that in spades when I was at USAA, where I just felt like I could go to folks and find my way and learn my way, and they would help me and guide me, and right, like, and I also think like you just got to be nice with people, like just in general, like regardless of who they are, because you never know what they control and what they do, right? Like especially like, you know, I've seen some folks, right, be nasty to like the people on the front desk, and it's like, why would you do that? They can control schedules, they control, right, like, and like these things are super valuable. So I think in terms of like a way to advocate for yourself is, first of all, like just be a good person to
Yes.
everyone around you, and in that way, like that fruit will kind of bear, and you'll see folks come through and fight for you and advocate for you and speak up for you. I mean, you do have to learn to do it yourself. There's definitely, that is definitely true, right? And that's something I'm still learning, especially when it comes to promotion, right? It's really hard to have that conversation, but it's one where you have to grease those wheels and you have to get going. But I think one of the ways to advocate for yourself is actually just being kind to everyone, and take, maybe like someone comes to you with a project, right, in industry especially, where you're like, well, that's kind of dumb, I don't want to do it, but hey, it's the first interaction I've had with this person, I'm gonna knock it out the park, because I don't know where they're headed in their career, even here or somewhere else, that like those networks and relationships are so vital. And that's one way to advocate for yourself.
And to build off of that, right? I think kindness, but also part of that is honesty, I would say, right? Where you say, look, I know that this is a difficult situation, or that, this is what you're offering, but let's be realistic. If you actually think I'm good, then this is something that minor quibble over 10% of a salary increase means a lot to me and really doesn't mean very much to you, right? Even to the point where when I was interviewing at Uber, after the conversation that we had where things were going well, I was asked to come back and do whiteboarding problems, which is very common in software engineering hiring roles. And I told the interviewer, I'm not going to do that. I said, that doesn't make any sense for hiring for the role that you want to hire for, right? I'm not a software developer. I know how to write code, but I'm not a developer, and I can't do that. If I went home and studied for a while again and tried to brush up on the stuff, I could, but you're hiring a data person. And so why are you interviewing me like a developer? Like, give me some data. And if I haven't done something interesting by the end of the day with the data, solving a problem that you're having with your data, then you know that I'm not the right person. But, and so they laughed and they said, I've never had somebody say, I don't want to interview this way, interview me this way instead. But it makes sense. So, okay, let's do that, right? And so it's those little moments where you can just be honest and just a human. I wasn't saying, hey, dummy, don't be dumb. I was saying, this doesn't really make sense for what we're having this conversation about. And I think that the most value for you and for me would come from like setting the stage right now, honestly, together. And so there's that sort of, there's something that you have to learn though, in order to do that. You have to learn to take those moments and just be outgoing for just a minute.
Yeah, it's really funny real quick because I did the same thing actually. And I never like I did like they slid me this piece of paper and like, I need you to whiteboard. And I was like, yeah, this doesn't right. No, I'm not going to because it doesn't make sense. I didn't get the job there, but you know, like, so take that as you will. We're not advocating that you do this, but yeah, I think you're right on with that 100%.
I love this conversation. I am going to have to jump. I've got a 4 o'clock, but thank you so much, Stella. I have to say I did this for love of Michaela, but I'm thrilled to have met you guys. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank
Love
you,
you.
Julia.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you. Bye. I just want to jump in to say, because I did write that question in the chat, what I was referring to there is someone in a mentorship position or in a leadership position, either in academia or in industry, who can advocate for your advancement. That was something that was really important for me when I moved into data science, was having bosses that were willing to be really creative in hiring and promotion and things like that. So I was fishing for something like that, but we are at the top of the hour. So
It sounds
We
so cheesy,
are.
but like being at this stage of my career, that's the most fun part now, is being the advocate and like
yeah.
seeing other people grow into those directions that they really want. I love that. I mean, it's just so wonderful. It's such a fantastic feeling.
Yeah, it's good to be on the other side too, right? Yeah.
We are at the top of the hour. Thank you all so much. If you are willing to just if you have any other advice that you want to share before we say goodbye to everyone, now's the time to do it. Do you have any sort of last sort of piece of wisdom that you want to share with everyone?
If I
here
start
today?
talking, I won't stop for 5 minutes. So I'll just say thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I'll just say, you know, at the end of the day, right, like, just remember what's important in your life and who's important in your life. You know, don't kill yourself over an expectation that you've set of, I need to be a tenured professor at this and do that. Like, set those limitations, have those negotiations, enjoy life, and that's it. And let life guide you.
Very well said. And thank you for that wise piece of parting advice. Thank you everyone for attending our career panel today. I hope you all got a lot from our discussion. I sure did. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Stella.